preparing a fianchetto for the bishop, aiming for a solid queenside pawn structure. Immediately contesting the center with the pawn creates a dynamic pawn tension that will shape the early middle game battles. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately stakes a claim on the center and prepares for queenside expansion. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal immediately contests the center and prepares for potential pawn pushes, aiming for dynamic play. Solidifying the pawn chain and opening lines for the queen creates potential central pressure. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the king's knight, this move creates a robust pawn chain and opens avenues for future pieces. Developing the knight to d2 prepares to support the center and potentially reroute the knight for a kingside attack or to contest the d-file. Developing the knight to a natural square prepares castling while also supporting potential pawn advances and controlling central squares. Aims to fianchetto the king's bishop for long-term diagonal pressure. Securing the kingside castling rights, this bishop's development prepares for immediate king safety and offers central support. Developing the bishop to g2 solidifies control over the long diagonal, creating pressure on black's d5 pawn and potentially supporting an eventual kingside pawn storm or central pawn push. Securing the king with castling is a fundamental defensive maneuver, but here it also strategically opens a diagonal for the bishop on f8, allowing it to participate more actively in the game and potentially challenge white's bishop on g2. Initiating a central pawn confrontation, this aggressive push immediately seeks to disrupt black's harmonious development and claim valuable territory, potentially leading to exciting tactical exchanges or a shift in the pawn structure that could favor kingside pressure. Reasserting central presence, this bishop strategically redeploys, aiming to exchange itself for white's more actively placed knight and potentially opening a diagonal for a future attack, while also preparing to defend the kingside. Shifting the knight to the rim often signals an intention to find a more active square later, perhaps f4 or even g5, to pressure black's kingside defenses after g3. This knight maneuver, while seemingly passive now, could be a long-term investment in controlling key diagonals and supporting an eventual pawn storm. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure, this subtle pawn advance aims to prevent white's knight from comfortably occupying the g5 square and potentially disrupting black's development or aiming for a kingside attack. It also creates a slight space buffer around the monarch, though at the cost of a potential weakness on the g6 square should white manage to open that flank later. Solidifying the kingside structure signals an intention to activate the queenside pawns and potentially target black's slightly passive development. Clearing the bishop's path from the initial congestion, this retreat strategically repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential future pawn breaks and offering defensive coverage for the kingside. Securing the king's position from potential diagonal threats by the bishop on h7, this is a prudent repositioning that also prepares for potential pawn advancements on the kingside, freeing up the g-file and reinforcing the central pawn structure's stability. This advance on the queenside aims to gain space and potentially open the a-file, but it weakens the b6 square and could isolate the pawn if white responds aggressively. It's a bold step that challenges black's queenside structure early in the game. Securing the queenside pawn majority with a more expansive territory on that flank is the immediate ambition, though it potentially weakens the b4 square for future maneuvers and locks the queenside minor pieces in place for a bit longer. A strategic redeployment, the knight journeys to the queenside flank, eyeing potential outposts and aiming to contest white's expanding control over the file, subtly preparing to challenge the initiative. Probing the knight's escape route, white bravely injects aggression into the center, aiming to dislodge black's f6 knight and potentially dominate the d6 square if it retreats. Harnessing the knight's mobility, black repositions it to a more active square, preparing to contest the d-file and potentially support an eventual c5 advance, while also creating a defensive screen for the king should white's central pawns push further. Pushing the f-pawn forward intensifies the central battle, aiming to seize more territory and restrict black's knights, particularly the one on d7, while potentially opening lines for the g2 bishop. The knight's bold venture to b4 immediately challenges white's pawn structure, aiming to disrupt the queenside stability that a4 was meant to secure and forcing a decision about the b3 pawn. Bringing the knight back to a more central square after its excursion offers greater flexibility, preparing for a potential kingside pawn advance or supporting the center. Black seizes the initiative by contesting the central pawn structure, aiming to break white's cramped position and gain active piece play, particularly for the knight on b4, which now has more breathing room. The rook's redeployment to e1 aims to solidify white's central pawn chain and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, but it also subtly relinquishes control over the d1 h5 diagonal, a liberty black might exploit. This tactical maneuver on the c-file aims to immediately contest control of an open file, a crucial element in many middle-game battles, while simultaneously offering support for potential pawn pushes further down the line and preparing to challenge white's pieces that are currently enjoying a comfortable central presence. Establishing dominion over the central open file is the immediate goal, preparing to potentially challenge black's control of the d-file and create opportunities for pawn breaks later. Shifting the knight to b6 offers fascinating possibilities for black. It's a strategic repositioning that aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the newly opened queenside diagonal. This maneuver hints at a desire to liberate the queenside, perhaps preparing a d4 pawn push to contest the center more directly, or even to eye the a4 pawn as a future target, disrupting white's queenside stability. It's a move that doesn't immediately unleash fireworks but builds subtle pressure, a patient accumulation of positional advantage. Refocusing the bishop to the queenside aims to challenge black's firmly established pawn chain and potentially open lines for an assault. Unleashing a pawn thrust to disrupt the queenside pawn structure, black seeks to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the bishop on g7 and potentially create attacking chances down the queenside. This move fundamentally alters the pawn dynamics, inviting white to either capture and create pawn weaknesses or allow black further queenside expansion. The resulting position will be characterized by increased tension on the queenside and a dynamic struggle for control of key squares. Confronting the central congestion directly, this capture aims to unravel the pawn chain and reclaim central space, though it opens lines that might also benefit black's repositioned knights. Suddenly, the central tension erupts, and black embraces the open lines, reclaiming the pawn with a clear strategic intention to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. This recapture isn't just about material equality. It's a calculated decision to introduce immediate complexity, forcing white to react to new tactical possibilities rather than continuing their slow development. Observe how the captured pawn at c4 now becomes a focal point, a potential weakness, or a launchpad for black's pieces depending on white's subsequent choices. Recapturing the pawn with the knight decisively resolves the central tension, but it introduces an immediate tactical conundrum, forcing black to defend the now exposed light squares around their king with perhaps less than ideal piece placement. The immediate capture of the knight on c4 creates a fascinating symmetrical pawn structure on the queenside, a stark contrast to the maneuvering that has defined the early game. This exchange on c4 not only opens the d-file, but also presents an opportunity for black to potentially exploit the slightly exposed white queen on d1 if it isn't supported carefully. Consider how this simplification might alter the potential for pawn breaks, and how the knightless squares will influence piece activity going forward. Unlocking the c-file is now the primary objective, as the bishop finally claims the open diagonal and establishes a powerful battery with the queen, creating immediate pressure on black's queenside and potentially disrupting their pawn structure. Black's knight, after a circuitous journey, has boldly infiltrated the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate tactical chaos. This aggressive maneuver highlights black's willingness to sacrifice material for dynamic compensation, seeking to exploit the momentarily exposed position of white's light-squared bishop and potentially open lines towards the king. The immediate threat of the knight on c2 forces white to react, potentially diverting resources from their intended central play. This adventurous sortie transforms the battlefield into a complex, tactical struggle, demanding precise calculation from both sides. Bringing the rook to guard against the immediate threat of the pawn advance, and clearing the way for the other rook offers a subtle positional adjustment, aiming to untangle white's slightly cramped queenside. Unleashing the queen in this exchange offers a tantalizing glimpse into a potential endgame, but beware the subtle positional concessions made to achieve it. The bishop pair for white, coupled with the open c-file and the king's somewhat exposed position, might just be too much to overcome for black's momentarily dominant queen. Regaining the rook sacrifices tactical pressure for a simplified pawn structure, initiating an endgame where white aims to leverage their two bishops against black's limited piece activity. Opening the d-file now is a shrewd decision, aiming to activate the rook and pressure white's potentially vulnerable pawn structure down the center, while also preparing for a dynamic endgame transition should exchanges continue. Re-establishing the rook on its original file, white aims to generate counterplay by contesting the open c-file and potentially launching an assault down the now partially cleared d-file, while simultaneously preparing for a potential queen trade. The knight's daring foray into e3 creates a fascinating positional puzzle, immediately disrupting white's rook battery on the d-file and forcing a difficult decision regarding its placement. Initiating a decisive rook exchange, white simplifies the position while forcing black to commit their remaining pieces, a common tactic when aiming to exploit a material advantage or transition into a favorable endgame. The exchange of rooks fundamentally alters the endgame dynamics, now emphasizing the struggle for central control and the long-term implications of pawn structure. Securing the open c-file with the rook establishes a dominant presence and prepares for a potential queenside pawn push or the eventual centralization of the remaining rook. Finally, recapturing the piece that blundered away a pawn. This maneuver clears the central files and directly addresses the immediate material imbalance, though the endgame that emerges will require careful navigation of the open c-file. Opening the b-file now presents a crucial decision regarding pawn structure, potentially creating imbalances that will define the ensuing endgame. The bishop now finds a more active square, eyeing the kingside and offering potential diagonal pressure. Securing the king's safety by tucking it away on the g2 square, the monarch now retreats from the immediate tactical skirmishes, allowing other pieces to potentially redeploy and prepare for the complexities of the emerging pawn structure. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal after its foray onto the c2 square proved a temporary distraction, now aiming to support a potential advance on the queenside. Reclaiming the open file is paramount now, as the centralization of your rook effectively re-establishes a commanding presence on the now half-open e-file. The bishop repositions, seeking a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the king. Re-establishing control over the central open file seems paramount, aiming to prevent black's bishop from dominating the weakened kingside after its recent repositioning. This retreat of the bishop, while seemingly defensive, relinquishes crucial squares and allows white's rook to solidify its presence on the open file, hinting at a slow grind where white's central pawns might eventually become problematic. The rook's penetration to the 7th rank, a classic endgame maneuver, now aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and exert pressure on white's remaining pawns. Black's bishop suddenly relocates to the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially harass the rook. Seizing the now undefended b7 pawn aims to disrupt black's coordination, but it comes at the cost of exposing your rook to potential pins and forks on the c-file, a dangerous game given black's bishop outpost. Seizing that bishop on a4 opens up the file for black's rook and immediately forces white to consider the safety of their pieces. Black's aggressive counterplay, triggered by that initial pawn push and subsequent piece activity, has successfully disrupted white's pawn structure and created immediate tactical opportunities. This gambit of material for active piece play has now paid off, creating an imbalance that white must carefully navigate. Unleashing a surprise sortie, the rook ventures deep into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially isolate the advanced knight on a4. The rook's triumphant recapture on c4, snatching a pawn, now creates a glaring vulnerability for white's overextended kingside pawns and demands immediate attention to the open c-file, potentially opening up new avenues for attack or forcing a disadvantageous pawn structure exchange. Seeking to untangle the positional bind, this knight repositions to potentially disrupt black's centralized pawns and threaten infiltration. Pouncing on the suddenly exposed white queen's rook, this check injects immediate drama, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and perhaps gain material or a tactical advantage before the queens are off. Relocating the monarch from the exposed third rank to the relative safety of the third rank's opposite corner, preparing for a potential defensive repositioning should the central files open further. The bishop's retreat to the edge of the board initiates a fascinating battle for control over the remaining open files, forcing white to carefully consider how to activate their rook without conceding further positional advantage. Capturing the pawn here, while seemingly gaining material, unfortunately sacrifices the bishop's crucial defensive post on the open file, creating a precarious situation for the white king that will demand vigilant guarding. The rook's return to the second rank allows it to eye potential weaknesses, but the exposed king remains the primary concern, begging for immediate attention before white can consolidate. The knight's journey to a6 now eyes the b4 square, a potentially disruptive outpost, while simultaneously retreating from the d8 rook's threat, suggesting a subtle repositioning rather than an immediate tactical blow. Unleashing a surprising bishop check, black aims to disrupt white's rook and knight coordination, forcing a potentially awkward retreat or exchange that could open up the king's defenses. Escaping the mate threat, the king scrambles towards the queenside, seeking refuge but leaving the pawn structure exposed. The rooks now stare each other down on adjacent files, a silent prelude to the inevitable clash for dominance over the open board. Relocating the king to the third rank exposes it to a potential storm of checks from the rook on its current diagonal, forcing vigilance. Sacrificing material to activate dormant pieces and disrupt the opponent's pawn structure often opens up unexpected attacking avenues, even when it seems like a concession. Raiding black's queenside pawn structure now forces a difficult decision for black regarding the advanced rook. Seeking to activate the rook on a freshly cleared file after the pawn exchange, this maneuver aims to penetrate white's position and disrupt their pawn structure, potentially creating new targets for exploitation. Seizing the 8th rank with this rook forces a crucial decision for black regarding the king's safety. The king seeks sanctuary on the edge of the board, a common refuge when the central squares become too hot, but it's a precarious position where the opponent's rook can patrol the open file with menacing efficiency. Exploiting the open files after black's bishop retreat creates immediate pressure and limits their counterplay significantly. The king ventures out, seeking activity but exposing itself to potential threats across the board. Unleashing the pawn storm to claim the queenside territory. Carving out a new avenue for the rook to join the fray, this advance seeks to activate the pawn's potential for disruption, potentially creating past pawn threats or forcing white's pieces into awkward defensive postures. Asserting control over the open files, this rook aims to pin down the enemy king and exploit weaknesses on the queenside, creating immediate pressure. Harnessing the open avenue, black pushes the pawn to threaten occupation of the 7th rank, aiming to destabilize white's rook and potentially create a passed pawn threat. Exposing the black king to increased pressure, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's defensive structure and potentially open diagonals for white's remaining pieces. Black's king is now precariously exposed, a consequence of the pawn push forcing it into the open, highlighting a critical weakness that white can exploit with further aggressive piece play. Opening the floodgates for your rook to sweep across the 7th rank. Embracing the inevitable pawn push, this capture reopens the f-file, offering a potential lifeline for the king by clearing a path for defensive maneuvers and challenging the central pawn mass. Seizing the open file with the rook now pressures the pawn structure and aims to restrict black's remaining pieces. A desperate bid for activity, bringing the rook to the first rank to challenge the dominant white pawn and perhaps disrupt the impending material collapse. The rook scuttles to the edge, aiming to box in the black king and sever the pawn's advance. Pushing the pawn forward now creates a critical passed pawn, forcing white's rook into a defensive posture and potentially opening lines for black's own king should the endgame simplify further. The white king boldly steps back, re-establishing a safer perimeter behind the f-pawn, a necessary retreat as the black pawn storm surges forward and the rook eyes open files. The black king, having ventured out, now finds itself the prime target for a swift mating attack, a stark consequence of sacrificing material for temporary activity. Focusing on the exposed monarch, white's king now ventures to h2, a seemingly minor shift but crucial for avoiding immediate threats and preparing for the endgame skirmishes. A valiant attempt to create a passed pawn, but it feels like a desperate measure in a losing position. The king's exposure is now a significant weakness, and the pawn's advance won't be enough to distract white from exploiting the vulnerable king and open files. Unleashing the pawn creates an immediate storm on the king side, forcing a decisive reaction from black's vulnerable monarch. Entering this endgame, the rook's advance into the enemy position creates immediate threats against the exposed white king. Bringing the rook across to the 7th rank was a shrewd maneuver, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create escape squares for the king. Now, the rook's check forces black to address an immediate threat, potentially sacrificing a pawn in the process. This aggressive play leverages the discovered threat of a mating attack that could arise if the black king is not carefully protected. Securing the passed pawn's march forward becomes paramount, though vigilance is required to prevent the opposing monarch from becoming an active participant in the fray. The rook's repositioning aims to exploit the now open file and disrupt the opponent's pawn structure, forcing a difficult decision on how to defend the isolated king's side. The rook's descent to the 6th rank solidifies its dominance over the open file, effectively shutting down any lingering hope of black's pawns advancing further and creating a dangerous passed pawn. Repositioning the monarch to the opposing flank offers crucial protection against any unexpected cavalry charges by the black rook. The king, now exposed, finds itself facing an immediate checking threat, forcing a reactive repositioning that concedes further ground. The king ventures into the fray, aiming to bolster the pawn structure and potentially create a discovered attack. Shifting the rook to the edge of the board offers no immediate tactical advantage, allowing white's king to consolidate its position behind the pawn chain and potentially prepare for a central breakthrough. Securing the king is paramount as the opponent's rook dances on the 7th rank, creating a precarious situation for your monarch. The pawn push on the king side signals a desperate attempt to create counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's well-coordinated pieces and perhaps open a path for the rook. The rook's return to the 8th rank offers a chance to solidify the position, preparing for a potential pawn push while keeping an eye on the opposition's king's remaining escape squares. Unleashing a desperate pawn push, black hopes to disrupt white's now overwhelming rook and king stranglehold, creating a sliver of counterplay through potential activity on the king side. The white king voluntarily steps into a dangerous zone, seemingly inviting further complications with the black pawn storm brewing on the king side, a risky gamble when material is so evenly matched. Unleashing a final energetic push, the rook on e3 drives the white king into a corner, seeking to exploit the exposed monarch and potentially create mating threats or force concessions in this tense endgame. Securing the king against the lurking rook is paramount, as a misplaced monarch invites immediate danger. Delving into a complex endgame, this forcing check injects immediate life, aiming to disrupt white's well-positioned monarch and potentially open pathways for counterplay with the rook. The monarch scurries away from the advancing pawns, seeking refuge on a more secure square, a necessary evasion to prolong the struggle. A desperate sortie, the rook ventures to the queen side, hoping to find a tactical spark amidst the pawn storm. Pivoting the rook to the g-file unleashes an immediate threat, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and potentially force a mating net. Embracing the chaos, black's monarch ventures out, seeking to disrupt white's rook dominance and open avenues for counterplay in this rapidly unraveling position. King hunt initiated by the rook's sudden appearance, forcing the black monarch to the edge of the board and creating a precarious situation. The black king, now a bit of a nomad, seeks sanctuary amidst the advancing pawns, hoping its newfound freedom won't be its undoing. The rook retreats to the second rank, preparing to support the pawn's advance and regain coordination with its counterpart, aiming to tighten the grip on black's weak kingside pawns. The pawn storm on the kingside, initiated by black, now feels a bit like a desperate surge. The king sits rather exposed behind a thin screen of pawns, and the advanced queenside pawns offer little immediate compensation for the potential weaknesses this aggressive push creates. The rook's repositioning aims to cut off the black king's potential escape route and restrict its movement, tightening the noose around the pawn storm brewing on the kingside. Sacrificing the pawn with that discovered check aims to disrupt white's well-coordinated pieces and create a potential mating net around the king, even if it means giving up material in the process.